Hello, and thanks for stopping by. As well as being one of London's most intimidating landmarks, the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, or as it's better known, the Old Bailey, is, without doubt, one of the most famous courts of law in the world. With a history stretching back many centuries, it's a place that's become synonymous with the nation's most notorious cases. The abomination of Amelia Dyer, the so-called baby farmer, the character assassination of Oscar Wilde, the sensation surrounding Dr. Crippen, and the treachery of William Joyce, aka Lord Haw-Haw. It served as the backdrop for the controversies surrounding the executions of Timothy Evans, Derek Bentley, and Ruth Ellis, and played a key role in bringing down infamous criminal enterprises such as the Great Train Robbers, the Kray Twins, and the Brinksmat Gang. Most grimly of all, the Old Bailey has borne witness to a harrowing litany of atrocities committed by Britain's most horrific killers. John George Haigh, the acid bath murderer, John Christie, the monster of 10 Rillington Place, Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, Dennis Nilsen, the Muswell Hill murderer, and many more. Unfortunately, this disturbing list goes on and on. Today, the Old Bailey primarily handles serious cases from within the Greater London area, although in instances where cases are particularly complex or high profile, it also presides over trials from other parts of the country. In this video, I'd like to take you on a journey through the history of the Old Bailey, from medieval times to the present day, and highlight some intriguing facts and details which you may not have been aware of. Such as, where did the name Old Bailey come from? Why was the court once open to the elements? And what's the story behind this shard of glass embedded in the ceiling? Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. At certain points in the video, I will be showing you images taken inside the Old Bailey itself. These were captured during a tour of this remarkable building, a tour which I'd highly recommend, by the way. I'll leave a link in the description. However, as I'm sure you can appreciate, the interior of the Central Criminal Court is subject to very strict security measures, and there are certain areas where photography is forbidden. So in the cases where I'm not able to show you raw footage, I'll do my best to fill in the gaps with historical images, along with clips from film and TV shows which feature the building. Anyway, on that note, please be seated, and we shall proceed. As it stands today, the building which embodies the Old Bailey is relatively recent in terms of London history. The oldest section was built at the turn of the 20th century, whilst the more modern extension opened in the early 1970s. However, the Old Bailey and the spot upon which it stands have been associated with law and order since the late 12th century, for it was then, in around the year 1190, that a prison was established here. Back then, the western stretch of London's old Roman wall, which still provided a defensive barrier for the city, ran right along here. Indeed, the courtrooms, which lie within the Old Bailey today, are lined along its former path. And when work was being carried out on the modern extension, a section of the Roman wall was unearthed, a relic which remains in situ in the Old Bailey's basement today. A large gatehouse, providing access to and from the west, was located on this section of London Wall. It was known as Newgate, and so that's the name by which the jail came to be known. For the first few centuries of its life, Newgate functioned both as a prison and a courthouse, and being a dark, overcrowded place overseen by corrupt jailers, it gained a fearsome reputation, a place where, thanks to dreadful sanitation, there are frequent outbreaks of an illness which came to be dubbed jail fever. As such, when London's most famous Lord Mayor, Richard Whittington, passed away in 1423, leaving a financial legacy which he asked to be donated towards works of charity for the good of his soul, the city's elders decided to use part of the cash to rebuild Newgate Prison, which, even by that point, was already over 230 years old. At first, the new Newgate, which was built using Whittington's kind endowment, continued to conduct trials within the prison walls, and it was not until many decades later, in 1539, that it was decided to separate the courtroom from the jail. This new purpose-built Sessions House, as it was called, was erected next to the prison on the site of a ballium, a fortified enclosure which stood on London Wall. During the medieval era, the word ballium had evolved into bailey, a term used to describe an outer protective wall. And so, this is where the phrase Old Bailey originates from, used both as a nickname for the Central Criminal Court and the street upon which it stands. Another address once associated with this area was the Press Yard, a patch of ground which was once located beside Newgate Gaol. Although this term sounds harmless enough, the Press Yard was in fact a place of unimaginable torment, for it was a space set aside to conduct the torture known as pressing, in which heavy weights would be placed upon a recumbent prisoner's chest. This savage punishment was administered to those who refused to offer a plea in court, because if you did so, your property, and subsequently your family's inheritance, could be seized by the Crown. In later years, the Press Yard was used as a venue for floggings, and this brutal address has now vanished beneath the modern complex of courts. Today, inside the lower hall of the Old Bailey, you can see a display cabinet showcasing other vicious implements which were employed in days gone by, such as this iron waistband with cuffs, this nasty looking cosh, which rather appropriately was known as a skull cracker, and these massive leg irons which weigh in at 50 pounds or 23 kilograms. The first incarnation of the Old Bailey stood for 120 years before it was destroyed by the Great Fire of London in 1666. It didn't take too long to rebuild though, and by 1673, the second Old Bailey, a brick Italianate structure dubbed the Justice Hall, was up and running. Rather unusually, one end of the courtroom, and there was only one courtroom in those days, was, as seen in this illustration, open to the elements. Not ideal considering the ups and downs of British weather. It was designed like this in an attempt to combat the still prevalent jail fever, as back then it was believed disease was spread by miasma, or bad air, and so it was figured that by leaving out an entire wall, plenty of fresh air would be able to circulate. However, as well as letting in all manner of rain, heat and wind, the open-air court also encouraged unruly crowds of spectators to gather, and so in 1737, after some 60 years, the open wall was closed in. Fears concerning jail fever remained though, not helped by the fact that there was a major outbreak in 1750 which claimed the lives of many people, including the Lord Mayor. And so attempts to combat the foul air were made by scattering strong-smelling herbs throughout the courtroom. Furthermore, the Old Bailey's judges took to carrying nosegays of sweet-smelling posies with them, and this is a tradition which remains to this day, when similar bundles of flowers are carried by judges on ceremonial occasions. In 1774, the Old Bailey Courthouse was rebuilt once again, this time to a design by the celebrated architect George Dance the Younger. You can see a blue plaque dedicated to him at his former home on Gower Street in Bloomsbury. Compared to what had gone before, Dance's Old Bailey was considered the pinnacle of courtroom design, and the layout he fashioned went on to provide the basis for every other courtroom in Britain, and indeed the Empire. This third incarnation of the Old Bailey came with all manner of mod cons, including a grand dining room for the judges and a private waiting room for witnesses, who before then usually had to await their turn in a nearby tavern, which probably didn't do their ability to provide an accurate account much good. To facilitate the transfer of defendants, the third Old Bailey was also directly connected to Newgate Prison by a special passageway. This path came to be nicknamed Birdcage Walk, mainly because it had a latticed iron roof, but also no doubt as an ironic nod to the far more picturesque Birdcage Walk which runs along the southern perimeter of St James's Park. At around the same time this version of the Old Bailey appeared, Newgate Prison was also rebuilt, transforming it into the huge, dreaded block which the likes of Charles Dickens came to know. When this incarnation of Newgate opened, it became the main venue for public executions, which were held at this spot opposite the present-day Old Bailey, an area where people now come to relax beside a peaceful fountain. Prior to being staged here, public hangings had been held at Tyburn next to present-day Marble Arch, and when they switched to the Newgate site, they remained as popular as ever. A pub here called the Magpie Stump, which lives on today within a modern building, did a roaring trade, offering seats with the best views to those who could afford it. The last public execution at Newgate took place in 1868, after which they were conducted within the prison walls. Another pub which stands opposite the Old Bailey is the Viaduct Tavern, which dates from 1869 and is named after the nearby Holborn Viaduct. Inside the Viaduct Tavern, you'll see a collection of heads lined around the ceiling. I was once told that these represent the heads of judges who worked at the Old Bailey, although I'm not quite sure how true that is. Another legend is that the cellar below the pub once formed cells for Newgate Prison, although given the dates, I'm pretty sure that's a myth too. Sorry to spoil the fun. One piece of infrastructure related to executions, which still exists beneath the present-day Old Bailey, is a white-tiled passage known as Deadman's Walk, a path which led from the condemned cell to the gallows yard. The arches along this passageway were designed in such a manner that they become increasingly narrow as you walk along. In other words, as a means of helping the guards to restrain the condemned convict as they were marched ever closer towards the noose. Another fragment of Newgate Prison, in this case part of its old wall, can just about be seen through this archway on Amen Court, although as it's on private property, it's not possible for the public to view close up. Throughout the 19th century, the Old Bailey continued to expand piecemeal as London's ever-growing population inflicted pressure upon the court. As early as the 1850s, a committee declared that both the Old Bailey and neighbouring prison were unfit for purpose, their recommendation being that both should be knocked down and rebuilt. It would take several more decades before the suggestion was acted upon though, and by the time it was, in the late 1890s, it was decided that there was no longer a need for Newgate Prison, as there were now plenty of similar institutions serving the capital. The Old Bailey was a crucial piece of infrastructure though, and so, considering it needed to be greatly enlarged, it was decided to build a huge new central criminal court on the site of Newgate Jail. The Royal Institute of British Architects were asked to nominate 6 of their members, each of who was to draw up a design for the new court. The plan chosen was created by Edward William Mountford, whose other London works include Battersea Library and Battersea Town Hall, now Battersea Arts Centre, largely because his design incorporated a grand dome, which complemented that of nearby St Paul's Cathedral. As this stone shows, the foundations were laid in 1902. It took 5 years to construct the Old Bailey we see today, and it was officially opened by King Edward VII on the 27th of February 1907. It's said that this small lift, beside the original main entrance, was especially installed for him to use on that day. Upon opening in 1907, the Old Bailey was fitted out with 7 courtrooms. As we'll soon see, there are now many more. and for a good few years it was referred to as the New Old Bailey. Its most famous feature, of course, one of which is now a prominent London landmark, is the statue of Lady Justice, which holds pride of place atop the 67-foot high dome. Clad in gold leaf, the statue of Lady Justice stands at 12 feet or 3.7 metres tall, with an arm span of 2.4 metres, and she weighs in at an impressive 22 tonnes. Stats which are difficult to appreciate all the way down here on the ground. Although she carries the traditional sword of authority and scales of justice, the Old Bailey's Lady Justice isn't blindfolded. This is in reference to the original Roman depiction of the goddess of justice, for the blindfold symbolising impartiality didn't come into vogue until the 16th century. Plus, it was said at the time that her maidenly form should be considered more than enough to represent neutrality. Make of that what you will. The Old Bailey's Lady Justice was sculpted by William Pomeroy, who also created these figures above the original entrance, now used only for ceremonial occasions, which represents the recording angel, fortitude, and truth. The inscription above them, meanwhile, defend the children of the poor and punish the wrongdoer, is taken from Psalm 72. Although thousands of passers-by see the exterior of the Old Bailey's dome every day, not so many get to see its interior. So, allow me to show you inside. Isn't it incredible? Within the public area of the Old Bailey, there are two main levels, one upper, one lower, each of which are essentially large ornate halls leading off to the courtrooms. The upper level, just below the dome, is, as you can see, almost cathedral-like, and it's connected to the lower level by this equally grand staircase. Inside the dome itself are a number of paintings which depict the virtues of truth, learning, art, and labour, whilst lower down there are a collection of murals illustrating important scenes from legal history, such as the signing of Magna Carta. It is on the upper level, through this unassuming wooden door, that the public can enter the famous, or should that be infamous, Court Number 1, a commanding Edwardian room where some of Britain's gravest trials have been conducted. Court Number 1, as with other courtrooms within the Old Bailey, has a large dock where the defendant sits, in the corner of which is a discreet staircase leading down to the holding cells. As I'm sure you can appreciate, due to security, I'm not able to show you any images of the Old Bailey cells as they appear today, although you can see them in these two images dating from 1920, back when they were divided into a men's corridor and a women's corridor. The 1948 Alfred Hitchcock film, The Paradigm Case, also does a very good job of representing them. Speaking as someone who has seen them, on the tour I mentioned earlier, I hasten to add, not as someone who's been up in the dock, I can say that, going by these representations, the cells appear to have changed very little. The Old Bailey has two categories of cells, lined along two narrow corridors, Category A and Category B, Category A being for those defendants who are deemed most dangerous. The Category B cells are painted blue and yellow, and one thing I noticed were the distinctive worn marks on the floor, which appear to have been carved out by countless defendants over the years, as they sit on the bench tapping their feet. The Category A cells are far more stark, and largely covered in graffiti, some of it artistic, much of it crude. None of the cells have lavatories. Those wishing to go have to be taken to a small open cubicle at the end of the corridor, where a guard keeps constant watch. Something else that is very noticeable, both in the cells and other parts of the Old Bailey, is that you can feel and hear the rumble of tube trains as they pass deep below on the central line between St Paul's and Chancery Lane. Another intriguing underground aspect of the Old Bailey is the huge boiler room, which may not seem so interesting at first, until you find out that it contains a special hatch, which provides access to the subterranean river fleet. Heading back up, The lower level of the 1907 building is, like the upper level, very grand indeed, being decorated with gorgeous marble from Sicily, Greece, Belgium and Sweden. One feature worth noting in this area is this large plaque, which commemorates a landmark trial involving William Mead and William Penn, the fellow who had gone to found Pennsylvania. Both Quakers, Mead and Penn, were arrested in 1670 for preaching to an unlawful assembly near Bishopsgate. They were promptly carted off to the Old Bailey, where the judge, Sir Samuel Starling, insisted that the jury find the pair guilty and that there would be dire consequences if they refused. The jury didn't go along with this though, and despite several days of bullying and intimidation, they stuck to their guns and declared the pair innocent. The case of Mead and Penn therefore set a precedent, stating that jurors have the right to come to a verdict based upon their own conscience, free from any external pressure. During World War II, on the 10th of May 1941, the northwestern side of the Old Bailey suffered heavy damage during an air raid. You can see the affected area in the 1948 film The Paradigm Case. 2 members of staff, Harry Dart and Harold Sheehy, were killed, and although the court was partially obliterated, the Old Bailey continued to operate. As the Latin inscription on its memorial tablet says, Fiat Justia Ruat Coelum. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. Eventually, the bombed out section was fully restored, opening on the 14th of October 1952, complete with this new mural, honouring the rescuers, nurses, firefighters and other civilians who worked during the Blitz. By the early 1960s, as in centuries past, it was becoming apparent that the Old Bailey was once again struggling to cope with demand, and so it was decided to add a huge new extension to the 1907 building. This new block was designed by the architects Donald McMorran and George Whitby, although sadly Donald passed away before the project was complete, whilst George died just a few months after it opened. The extension, which now provides the main entrance, is as grand and intimidating as its Edwardian counterpart. It opened on the 27th of September 1972 and is joined seamlessly to the older section, adding another 12 courtrooms, meaning there are now 18 in total. On the 8th of May 1973, just months after the extension opened, the Old Bailey was targeted by the Provisional IRA, who exploded a car bomb outside the court. Over 200 people were injured in the blast, which shattered the Old Bailey's huge windows, sending fragments of glass flying through the air like shrapnel, one shard of which can still be seen embedded in the ceiling of the extension to this very day. This fragment was left in place for 2 reasons. First, as a reminder of that dreadful day, and secondly, because it's so firmly stuck, it's simply impractical to remove. In the wake of the IRA attack, the Old Bailey's windows were fitted out with heavy blast curtains, which remain in place today, weighed down with lead, and ready to snare any flying glass in the event of any future blast. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tour of the Old Bailey, and as always, I'd be interested to hear your own thoughts. Have you ever sat in a public gallery here, or indeed the dock? And what's the most notorious case you think of whenever you hear the phrase Old Bailey? Please be sure to let me know in the comments. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus, of course, it'd be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching, friends. stay well, and please be sure to stay tuned.